People had to carry on as usual, worries or no worries, and he knew from his own experience how your circle of concern could be drawn in smaller and smaller. He couldn't honestly say he was much affected by the letters he received, telling of drastic messes some of his close relatives and friends had gotten into. A person's heart could shrink and shrink indefinitely like a habitually starved stomach. It got so that there was never a sympathetic pang that was not mitigated by the gladness that it was not you it happened to. Hey, this is Nick.
And this is David.
And this is Nathan, and welcome back to another episode of Deep Cultural Propaganda from the American Imperialists, also known as the Books of Some Substance podcast. On today's episode, we're discussing Eileen Chang's Naked Earth.
And this novel follows Liao Chuan as he moves through three basic campaigns of early Maoist China, divided between going through land reform, which kind of is the radical distribution of land, started in the 1950s throughout rural China. And then he moves on to the Three Antis campaign, which was the Communist Party's sort of desire to purge the ranks of its own government, which resulted in a lot of people being executed and imprisoned. And then finally, the Resist America Aid Korea campaign, which is him first doing propaganda for newspapers and magazines, and then it ends with him going and fighting in the Korean War in 1953. So the novel sort of follows him over these 3 years, these three major campaigns, and he's dealing with all of the advances in Maoist China, also learning how to fall in love. So the first question, as always, we'll start with Nick. Is this book of substance?
I'm going to go with yes, and I'm going to weight that pretty heavily in its history and its relevance and its connection to the day. I think it does very much fit in with a lot of these kind of classics that we hear about, that, you know, your 1984, the kind of some of the buzz books that we're hearing about now, Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, Plot Against America by Philip Roth. But this is just from kind of a completely different angle that the West isn't totally used to, or at least in my opinion, probably doesn't easily pull history lessons from. So from that standpoint, I think this is definitely very substantial. I do kind of want to talk about some of the literary elements as we get into this as well. But I think that this is definitely something that fits into both today's relevance and is kind of an awesome window back into, you know, lessons from the past. So Nathan, you, substantial?
I'm going to go with yes, both for the reasons that you stated, being introduced to this history at a very intimate level. But I also just really enjoyed the book. I just devoured the book. I know that, you know, as a piece of literature, there's some criticism of its plot, of the fact that it was paid for by the United States Information Services as propaganda when it was first published in Hong Kong for the Chinese audience. But I really don't have any complaints about it. I really enjoyed it a lot. David?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think for Eileen Chang to sort of capture the beginnings of these atrocities, which most of the world didn't even know about, certainly at the time, and most of the world didn't learn about for many years. And even today, a lot of people don't really even think about how devastating it was. We often think of certainly Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, but Mao's China killed way more people than both of those combined. So it's a very interesting peek into how this all got started, because this novel takes place a year after Mao came into power, and for her to not even be in the same country, to be able to like write in depth and get not only the sort of truth on the ground, but to really, like Nathan said, develop a very individual sort of intimate character who navigates through these things, I thought was incredibly well done. So yes, definitely, it is a book of substance, not only for its what we've been calling this sort of time capsule effect, but also I think as a literary work, I think it works very well.
I want to stick on that for just a moment, the intimate portrayal of this period of history, given that she was from Shanghai, but when she wrote this book, she was, I believe, living in Hong Kong and then shortly after moved to the United States. But she wasn't in rural China. I mean, she didn't experience these things firsthand. But yet, to me, the portrayal of the atrocities felt very realistic. The way that people responded to things, the way that the government used various methods to coerce people into doing things that, went against their own consciences. It was, to me, it felt terrifyingly real. It didn't, and that's why, even though, it has an obvious anti-communist message, it never felt like propaganda to me, because every time somebody did something, it felt like, I felt like I could completely see somebody doing that given the circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, that writing approach kind of bridges the gap between a history lesson and something that you can relate to, essentially, right? I think that's part of the difficulty when you have these massive atrocities with millions who have lost their lives, trying to bring that back down from a statistic into something that feels relatable. And I think that is actually one of the biggest positives here. And I think, the things that gave me the kind of the biggest scares was just the behavior of the people who are ready to jump on the right side of politics, but who will obviously be judged on the wrong side of history. But just how quickly kind of these mediocre people who didn't really have a place before just were opportunistic and then got in line and suddenly had like the power slanted in their direction.
Are you talking about go forward, pal?
Yeah, exactly. Kind of just like, I don't know, I think of them as like the local meathead, right? But like just somebody who couldn't cut it before and now has a little bit of power, and that is just the absolute recipe for abusing it. And kind of these things starting to take off when they lose basically all connection to the intellectual basis that they started with, right? Because you can talk about what Maoism looks like on paper and Marxism and all that, but really what it comes down to is it's all just sort of decays into abuse of power. And that's the terrifying thing.
Yeah. And it's an abuse of power on every level, right?
Right.
Like you said, from the lowliest Kanpu to the highest comrade, all the way down to, the poorest farm worker. They all get wrapped up into this terrifying groupthink and are more or less coerced into not only confessing their own false sins, but blaming others for things that are not true at all, which results in murder and death and all sorts of terrible stuff.
I want to compare her approach to, some other, not necessarily historical, but dystopian novels like 1984, which we've probably all read in high school. Which we read earlier in book club. Brave New World, Heart of a Dog, and Master and Margarita, and even to some degree, Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt. And each one of those books, I think, represents sort of a moral tale. It's trying to warn you about what might happen. But comparing it to this book, it seems kind of like cardboard. Like the characters, it relies on a lot of like unknowns, Deus Ex Machina, almost supernatural events. Whereas this, rather than getting into, things beyond the human experience, there's a lot that's not known by the characters in reading it. It all happens like directly in front of the protagonist. And I thought there was something particularly powerful in that.
Yeah.
Because it never talks about, the political theories that led to this. It's just what happens to people to people on the ground, to people in town.
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with two big things: the sort of historicity of the events and the way that it keeps the characters almost in the present moment at all times, right? That the way that we follow the main character, and the few minor chapters where you're actually with a different character altogether, which maybe we can talk about why she does that, but you're mostly with one person and you just follow him along as he's swept away by each increasing moment of madness. So you're always in that moment. There's not a lot of looking back or looking forward.
Yeah, I just feel like there also wasn't necessary to invent a lot of stuff, right? It has a realist feel over everything. And I think the thing that made me just, that I wasn't expecting, was how surreal that could be, in the way that when you're reading a 1984 or something like that, there's always a small level of fantasy, because at some level the author had to make up a new style of something, right? How is this thing going to be tweaked in this futuristic society that's going to allow it to become more and more dystopian? But the thing that I got that vibe from in Naked Earth was when they would do a lot of the formal capitalization over all of the initiatives, and basically you would read sentences where like every other chunk of the sentence was a formal initiative, and you get, things like struggle rice and rough branch big leaf style of work and isolated retrospection. And like when those show up, you're like, oh wow, that's so surreal that seems almost like somebody's making it up, but that it's tied to like exact events. And then also, like, personally to me, I kind of laughed at some of these because a lot of them sound just like straight edge militant punk band names. Like Change of Weatherism, Disgorge Bitter Fluid, Thought Mobilization. Like, I probably own records by those bands with just like one of those words changed. So I was just getting a little bit out of it myself. But yeah, I think there's like a surreal element from things being so real that they sort of invert themselves again, and I thought that was super impactful.
There was a few moments where I even wrote, like, in the margins, this feels like it could be a fantastical dystopian novel. And it was a lot of those same moments. The key one, there was a few, but anytime there was the, and pardon the pronunciation, the tan pai, where people had to get up and sort of confess all of the misdeeds they've done. And there was the key one with Comrade Ko Shan, when she got up to confess. And I believe the main character, Liao, commends her for her use of communist vocabulary as a way of sort of navigating what I've been calling in my mind the sort of performativity of the whole thing. Like, everyone's always performing all the time, through vocabulary, through action, and they even start to sort of judge their own thoughts from time to time as well.
Yeah, I love that those confessions, that if you over-confessed, you were actually rewarded for it in the end. And so in a weird way, this style of trying to keep everybody sort of equal and on the same page actually ended up with a highly competitive element, which is the exact opposite of what a flat, like, communistic society is supposed to be. And so they just have found different ways of inverting things and injecting competition into the things that were supposed to keep everything even.
It's just a different scoring system.
Exactly, right.
Only the scoring doesn't actually result in anything good. It's like a high score doesn't actually mean that you've contributed anything.
Right.
Well, and I think the key thing is more, it's a show that you know how to behave, that you're willing to capitulate more than anything.
There was that beautiful quote near the beginning of the book when Sunan, the primary love interest of the protagonist, has to confess, and then she's caught crying in the field, and then they accuse her of not meaning it, and then she flips that around and she says something like, no, she was crying because she was overwhelmed with joy that so many of her fellow Kanpu cared so much about her to call her out on it. It's incredible.
Yeah, that's just like a swoosh in terms of like nailing it perfectly.
Yeah, and maybe that's why she could get away with so much, because she was the most intellectually agile of everybody in the story.
Yeah.
Because for the whole story, I mean, she pretty much, she was the only one with any integrity in the whole story, I think.
Yeah, we should talk about integrity, because that was actually, so with Leo and his sort of descent into, say, decaying morals and kind of the impact of that, while Sunan kind of kept the baseline and she was the one hanging on to, I don't know, I would say less tainted behaviors. And I actually kind of wanted Leo to fall more. I thought that would have been more impactful. And you could argue that he fell pretty far, right? I mean, at the end of the novel, he ends up taking a job, as in the resistance in the Korean War, and it's absolute kind of chaos. And the main reason he does that is because he wants to get away from China and all memories of Sunan. But I kind of, from a literary standpoint, thought he would have been a better example, or it would have been more impactful had he just, fallen all of the way.
Now, what do you mean fallen?
So my biggest beef with this novel is actually like the last chapter or two. Okay. I was expecting Chang, because I've read a couple of her other stories where the ends don't have any positive redirection, they just sort of end up with it is what it is. And I think the biggest gripe I have with this is his decision to go back into China in the end and sort of the patriotic implications of that.
Oh, you read that as patriotic?
Yeah, I read that as like, this is where I'm from. If I go back and we continue to hang on, there will be an opportunity to truly stand up. And then that's why I'm there. So I guess maybe that's a good point. How did you guys read that? Because I read it as like, oh, this is where you got paid. Like, this is why you wrote this story. Where if I was writing it from like a literary standpoint, I just would have like let the dude completely fall off. I thought he was going to die in the war.
Wait, can we take a step back real quick?
Absolutely.
And describe for the listener just a little bit of the basic plot points, because I think we've covered kind of the history element of it. But
yeah,
how are we saying his name?
Leo
and Sunan were both young college graduates at the beginning of the story, participating in land reform. And then they separate, they go off to various departments, and we don't really know what happens to Sunan, but Leo kind of starts to participate in some level of immoral corruption. Obscure relations.
I believe it,
that's
when capitalized.
That's the term I was looking for. And then Sunan rejoins him halfway through the book or so. And then as things ramp up, the 3 antis and the 5 antis campaigns, Leo gets further wrapped up in this, goes to prison. Sunan saves him. She dies. Leo goes to the front, the Korean front, and now we're here at the end of the book.
And is eventually captured as a POW and makes his decision to go back to China.
Right.
So one quick thing that I want to actually ask and possibly argue, I don't think Sunan actually saves him.
What?
Oh.
That was what made her story even more tragic, because in the story, in order to save him, she ends up hooking up with this high official who impregnates her. She wants to abort the child, and through the abortion, there's a complication. She bleeds to death and dies, right? So she becomes this sort of martyr figure. But there's a brief conversation between her and Koshan where she even admits that I can't remember the guy's name, the high-up comrade that said he was going to help her. They even admit to each other that he won't do anything. He just used her.
I think it's ambiguous, because she definitely believes that it came to nothing, that she didn't save him.
Yes, and he's not released in any sort of time frame that would suggest he was helped. It's more, hey, this guy's really stubborn, but we really don't have any evidence on him. And I think even the narrator of the book sort of says Liao knew, and everyone knew him. He was released because there was no evidence to prove he did anything.
But isn't there also no evidence to prove that anyone did anything anyway?
Yeah, I guess the pattern of the rest of the book was
is that executions prove your guilt,
it's
right?
Exactly. It's like easier to just execute the person than to release them and deal with that.
They obviously can't and don't execute everyone, and he was of use to the party.
As a free or as a non-imprisoned?
Yeah.
As an alive man?
Yeah, as an alive man, I think they seem to have more use for him. Or it could have just been random. I mean, what was going on there was so chaotic. There was no real authority to say, okay, well, I guess this guy's not that bad. It was more like, well, let's kill 3 soldiers to prove a point today.
And maybe the point is as much that it's not really
clear.
Matter.
Exactly.
Yeah. I actually like that interpretation better than mine. It sort of makes me dig it more. Just like the chaos of it, and how there's no deterministic inputs leading to outputs. How if she didn't save him, then the whole thing was for naught. It was pointless.
And he kind of goes on a mission to discover what happened to her after he gets out, right? And he
gets nowhere.
Figure anything out. He knows that she died, and he comes to the conclusion that she died having an abortion.
Yeah, but I feel like he also didn't actually put that much effort into it. I mean, he kind of asked around. He went to Koshan, and then I don't think he ever went to fully verify it. They mentioned that she was buried out in some like country area or something.
Well,
and then I don't think he went to go check that, unless I missed it.
No, there was a good line actually about that, because he went and interviewed people as well. He interviewed other girls that were in the hostel, and he said, what good would going out and seeing a mound, would that actually prove anything at all? Because anybody could be buried there, was the implication.
Right. But when I read that, I actually sort of, because some of Chang's other writings are very, call it fit for the silver screen. They're very cinematic. I was kind of like, I knew that this book had some pros and cons associated with it. People talk about its nature as being funded by the US government. I actually, when I read that line, I was like, oh, is she trying to do like a switcheroo thing? Like maybe Sunan's not actually dead. And that's when I got really nervous about the novel. And then as it continued, I realized that she is dead, and Leo sort of moved on, and he's just sort of a shell of a human being. I was like, oh, okay, we're good here.
Yeah.
But I thought she was going to do like a Tom Cruise ripping the mask off and then the Mission Impossible kind of ending. And I was like, no, don't do it. That'd be terrible.
Yeah, I had that fear when that letter showed up, and Leo thought it might be from her for a split second.
Yeah.
And I was like, no.
Yeah, exactly.
But, yeah. But I'm glad that it stayed wallowed in misery the rest of the narrative.
But this is my point, is I want it to be wallowed in like an extra inch of misery.
Well, let's talk about this, because I think you read the ending pretty optimistically.
Well, so here, let me call out what I'm talking about. So, when he goes and he's in the POW camp, and basically there's an opportunity to go back to China or go, I guess it's not even specified.
I go to Taiwan.
Yeah, it's Taiwan, I guess. Yeah.
Or the United States.
Or India. He's talking about India as well.
Or India, yeah.
Yeah. And he's sort of planning on doing that. And in a split second, he decides to go back to China. And he's worried about his friend in the POW camp, what he'll think of him for having gone back and whatnot. And then, but there's this section where they say they'd never completely trust him again, of course, but he'd work hard at any job they gave him, study the books, join the campaigns, help to hunt down the saboteurs and counter-revolutionaries when they told him to. And all the while he'd keep hidden the slow flame of hatred. He'd wait. He was in no hurry now. 10 years, 20 years, his chance would come. As long as one man like him remained alive and out of jail, the men who ruled China would never be safe. They're afraid too, he thought, afraid of the people they rule by fear. Which I just read as he's going back to play his part in being the seed for the eventual counter-revolution. And that, to me, when I read it, I was like, oh, okay, that's the potential propaganda element of this.
I agree with that reading of it for the most part, but I think that the reason he chose to do that did make sense to me, because it was really the most hopeless thing that he could do. He'd finally decided that he had something to die for, I think, versus continuing. I mean, that's why he went to Korea, was to die, basically.
Right.
And the idea of going and trying to build some kind of happy life in Taiwan or India or something, which is what he was planning to do until the last minute. He realized that he had no life left to live. Like, he had nothing.
He'd rather be a tool.
Yeah, I mean,
than have his own happiness.
It's hard to imagine a further bottom than that. And so he decides to go back to China to live a lie, but now he has, for the first time in the book, and I think in that chapter he kind of judges himself very harshly for never really having his own idea about things, and he's willing to die for this because Sunan had died for him, or so he believes.
Yeah, I read it as his penance, but penance with a potential path to absolution, albeit long and hard and grueling and full of darkness and unhappiness. But
there's hope there.
There's hope there, right? And so I think he's sacrificing basically long-term unhappiness for an element of hope versus long-term potential happiness for no element of hope. So that's what I like. Honestly, I was kind of saying whatever personal preferences, but I thought he was going to die in the war, and it was just kind of like one or two chapters before I thought it was just going to be over, and then that seemed to me the darkest, most impactful thing. Like, I was ready for that, and I was kind of getting excited for how...
Oh, like when he's in the ditch?
Yeah, exactly. And nobody was coming for him.
Nobody came and he just died.
Yeah. No, seriously, I would read the hell out of that book. But, I don't know, David, you're going to settle the score on this one?
Yeah, so I think that is certainly patriotic in the way that he believes China will eventually be saved, or at least Chang felt that way through the character, that somehow, as long as there were people like this still in China, they would be saved. Unfortunately, she didn't know about the Great Leap Forward and the, tens of millions of people that would be killed years later. I doubt Leo would have survived very long if he were to return. But yeah, I think I was afraid he was going to end up in America and there would be some sort of like happy little bow tied on it. So when that was disrupted, I felt better.
Yeah, that would be maximally too happy. I agree with that.
And that would have been too much propaganda.
Like he just got a cute little house in Connecticut and it just worked out.
Yeah.
And Sunan was waiting for him there.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So that fear, that expected fear sort of made me appreciate his decision to find absolution. I actually like that there's a little bit of hope, even though if you know the history, there's no hope coming after this.
Yeah. Yeah, I like it. I see all of the different levels and interpretations. Maybe I just transmit my own inner darkness into things as I'm reading them, and I should work on disgorging my own bitter thoughts. Maybe there's a useful lesson in this book outside of the political warnings.
But I think actually your dark ending would have even been more of a selling point for just how dark this time was.
Yeah.
I think it would have proved it even stronger. Like, listen, this guy went through all this, he struggled, and he died forgotten on a battlefield that nobody cared about.
Yeah, with a hole in his side while people walked by and he didn't have the ability to call out or the desire.
Yeah.
That's what, like, I think I like that a lot too. Is just his decaying effort and increasing apathy and just, desire to have the war take him. That, like, 2 chapters from the end I thought the book was the most impactful to me.
Once he's imprisoned, I thought from there to the end, I thought that was, and actually the opening, I thought the opening was incredibly strong because it throws you right into, on this bus of singing university students going to, help bring the world together. And then it just, it just gets darker and darker and darker until...
And it happens incredibly fast.
Happens real fast.
It happens incredibly fast. And Leo's last act in land reform is, executing a prisoner that wasn't properly shot.
Yeah. It only takes like 75 pages for them to hang up a pregnant woman, right? That was actually one of the tougher sections that I've read in recent memory. Was just that, kind of like we were talking about at the beginning, like just that opportunistic sort of mediocre, just follow the current party kind of guy who's just trying to one up and get his tiny gain at a massive loss.
But it's not even that. I mean, he's a difficult. I find him to be a difficult character to judge because if he was just ambitious, it's like, oh, well, he has the wrong attitude about things. But he just doesn't have an attitude about things.
Right.
He's generally, I think, good-natured, generally likes people, but doesn't ever stand up for anything. And one of the most, he's staying with this farming family and likes the farming family and feels like he's expanding his knowledge of the world and, he's helping these people. And then very quickly, this farmer that he's staying with gets reclassified from a middling farmer to a landlord, gets imprisoned, tortured, beaten, released, re-imprisoned, and finally executed by Leo himself. Meanwhile, Leo is kind of having this innocent, flirtatious relationship with the farmer's daughter.
Who gets her teeth knocked out when she tries to protect her father from getting shot.
That's pretty awful.
Who gets her teeth knocked out, asks Leo for help. He wants to help, but his desire not to get out of line supersedes that, and he just watches this tragedy unfold and just like lets himself be eaten, lets his soul be eaten out of his cavity in his heart.
To me, that's one of the strongest parts of this book. It does what, and I know, Nathan, you're familiar with the psychologist Jordan Peterson, right?
Yeah.
He teaches a class that shows how everyone in the class would be a Nazi if they were in the Third Reich Germany. Like, he goes through this process of showing how people just so easily give in to what's around them.
Yeah.
Just how simple it is for everybody, and even you, the reader, could just fall into something like this.
I think that's what's so powerful about it, is that reading it, I think, like, at what point would I have said, no, this is enough?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a hard thing.
I don't know that I would have. Because at that point, like, if he had said, no, this is enough, what would have happened to him? He wouldn't have changed anything, and he would be tortured and killed.
Yeah.
So why would you step out of line at that point? But then he gets further and further wrapped up in the party. But the stakes don't change for him. He doesn't get any more grace from the party, but at the same time, he's no closer to making any change.
So my previous comment about sort of the opportunistic, like mediocre guys was actually not about Leo, because I think he comes from like the more educated class. He's the college student and stuff. It's the tides that come when the masses get involved and that they're simply following. And then I think that becomes the barrier that pushes Leo, like as he's having those feelings out in the rural area and he knows all of this bad shit's happening, but he can't figure out how to stop it because he can't go against the party, and he eventually becomes more and more part of it. Like all of that isn't possible unless they get the masses involved, which is how, one of the most kind of oddly humorous but also terrifying parts in the early part of the novel is when the party members are helping people in the rural community sort of practice their political slogans and their performances, and calling out the landlords who are really not landlords. They're just people with barely more money than you. And like that to me is the scariest part, because eventually there's no way for you to go against that. And then sort of the question of, at what point would you submit to the authoritarian government, I think becomes pretty easy, because there's no way to escape it.
Yeah. Well, and this brings up a point that I think is never explicit in the book, and it's how do you defy such authoritarianism, and it's through sort of individual acts, and it's only when he's finally confronted and imprisoned and he's asked to confess and admit everything that he just refuses to. That's really the only time he can do anything specific.
When he's imprisoned, does he even know why he's imprisoned? I mean, does he even know what he could confess to?
Yeah.
Oh, he does.
He knows.
I think it's his obscure relations.
No, it was his relationship with what's his name?
With Su Ping?
Sui Ping, his boss, who was...
Oh, I read that wrong.
Whose story is also tragic. Well, his boss gets betrayed by his longtime friend and what's it called when you fight a war with somebody?
Buddy?
His war buddy? Who he'd saved this guy's life like 3 times, and the guy ultimately betrays him to the party. And then his wife goes around insisting on his innocence. But then after he's executed, she just turns to saving herself, and she denounces him too and says that he had brainwashed her.
Yeah, her comment, do you have that ready?
In her confession?
Yeah, where she was just hysterical for the longest time and then eventually caved in and gave the official response.
So this is her official letter that Leo was proofreading for her. Or this is a piece of it. She writes, Sui Ping, traitor to the people, despoiler of the nation, was charged with corruption and betrayal of the revolution. But my political nose was so insensitive that I was still deceived by him, believing in his innocence. And then she ends it. It was not until I had heard of traitor Sui Ping's execution that I suddenly woke up and came to my senses.
That's incredibly common, and it's even mentioned on the next page. And it says, I just want to read this because it's intense. He shouldn't think harshly of her for writing this letter. As everybody knew, it had become a routine now. Whenever a man was executed, some member of the family was required to submit an article denouncing him and expressing gratitude to the government for putting him to death.
Oof.
She had to write this for her own protection and her children's. It was the only intelligent thing to do once Sui's fate was settled, and he was beyond her help.
Yeah, that's the bummer times.
And many times the family had to pay for the bullet that went through their head.
God.
Yeah. So one thing we were talking about was basically how do you combat this, and it's through acts of being an individual, essentially. And I know we've kind of had some side discussions, but the book that people have mentioned kind of came up in one of our book club discussions, but On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder, who's like a Yale historian, I believe. And so he has 20 lessons in the book, and it's sort of this nice, like...
Which are a crazy compendium to this novel. That
Exactly.
Like every single point that he brings up, I think, is covered in the novel.
Yeah, and not only, like, they're all obviously referenced to shit that's happening right now. But it also is like the exact companion to Naked Earth as well. And so one that I thought was kind of one of the most impactful was his lesson number 4, which is take responsibility for the face of the world. And basically his point, and he uses the Czechoslovakian sort of communist era, and he refers to a writer by name of Havel who wrote a book called The Power of the Powerless. And so his point was, I'll just read a chunk of this. He says, he offered a parable of a greengrocer who places a sign reading, "Workers of the World Unite," in his shop window. And he then goes on to say that it is not that this man actually endorses the content of this quotation from the Communist Manifesto. He places this sign in his window so that he can withdraw into daily life without troubles from the authorities. When everyone else follows the same logic, the public sphere is covered with signs of loyalty, and the resistance becomes unthinkable. And that's kind of, I think that's like the biggest lesson of all of this, is that it has nothing to do with any of the political philosophy and backing. It has everything to do with just power grabs. And that's one of the most terrifying connections back into today's stuff. Is it just feels like people's political ideologies get adjusted based on what's being yelled the loudest and what's coming from the top, where it could be totally the opposite of what it was 6 months ago or a year ago or 5 years ago. But people will just continually make the small adjustments to not stand out. And if enough people do that, then suddenly you have this wave that basically nobody can beat individually, and it just becomes mass destruction.
And I think something that just made me think of this, throughout this book, you never really feel like anyone's a true believer. They're all just performing.
Right.
And even though they all know everyone's performing, if one person breaks from the performance, they are punished severely. And yet it's all an act, and they all know it's an act.
Well, wouldn't you say that they started as true believers?
It certainly seems that some of them have, but yeah, I think over time, and I think maybe even Liao probably believed a little bit. It certainly seems like he does at first.
Yeah. Take the parades, right? The small section about the people marching in parades.
That was one of my favorite scenes.
Yeah, and they're just like,
actually.
well, now we march in parades now.
Yeah.
And like they're kind of just like openly like, oh, this is garbage. I don't really want to do this with my free time, but this is a thing we got to do. Hold your sign.
But they mostly don't care. That's what's funny too. Is that they're like, oh, whatever. I guess we do this. It's a little inconvenient, but it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah. And they're so open about not caring that it seems reckless. But I think the authorities also know that they're getting the display. So if there's little tiny like comments and stuff, it's really not that big a deal because they're getting the mass, of the people marching with the slogans and the flags and the military and all that. Like they're getting the image that they want.
It's like the North Korean national television where if you don't clap, then you got the guy behind the camera with the AK-47 waiting for you.
Exactly.
But that was an aspect of the book that I also appreciated, was that not everybody's political. Not everybody's involved with atrocities and communism and all of this. Like, at least at this point, maybe, the Great Leap Forward took care of that. But at this point, a lot of people, none of the main characters, but a lot of the peripheral characters are going about their lives in a more or less ordinary fashion.
Leo makes a comment about that. He makes a comment that these people so far in the city of Shanghai are still protected from what's been happening in the countryside under land reform, but it will come here shortly. I can't remember the exact quote. I don't know where it is, but he says something along that line, or at least says it to himself.
Yeah. It's kind of it's the greengrocer thing. It's the quote that we read at the beginning about people having to carry on as usual while they build up an ever-increasing tolerance to basically being emotionally impacted by the shitty things that are happening around them. How is that not like a perfect lesson for modern times of just like your increasingly calloused like shell that you put on that helps you get through the day? Otherwise, the news you get is just pretty awful. So I don't know. I that's probably my favorite part about this is both the window into history and then just like the resonance that it has with modern times. And that's why this was impactful to me. So I'm mostly just kind of wondering also, just for like, call it literary canon purposes, right? I don't think this book is is widely read outside of Asia. I mean, it was written originally in Chinese, and then Chang translated it herself not that long after. And I think that's one of the reasons why this translation is actually pretty cool, in my opinion, because it builds definitions into the prose.
So this is the second book that she wrote that was funded by the United States Information Services.
Correct.
The first one, I was just doing a little research on this. The first one she had written mostly, and then basically the Information Services came in and paid her for it. This one was she was given an outline to write to, so it's a little bit more forced, at least from her perspective. But the first one was also published in English and did really well. But this one, she translated in English, but then nobody picked it up until I think the 70s.
Yeah, it says that original name of it was called Love in Redland, published in 1954 in Hong Kong, and in 1965.
The original name of it was, what was it?
Escape. Deep cuts here, fellas.
But she actually received the outline, and it had a title. I think it was Leaving the Korean Front or Escape from the Korean Front or something like that.
Okay. But the original title is... For a book that, to me, just fits in so well with stuff that's happening in modern times, it makes me just ask the question that I always ask myself is like, what else do I have no view into, right? What other lessons are there? What other works of art, books, music, film that just come from maybe an outside perspective that is at the first level an outside perspective, but really just proof that everything is pretty similar everywhere? And what else can we learn from that? And that kind of made my jaw drop with this book.
I want to question you a little bit about what you mean by relevance for modern times, unless you're thinking of Venezuela, where there's actual bloodshed. But are you talking more about just how people sort of form these ideological ways of speaking and falling into a certain line with something? Or what exactly are you referring to? Because I'm not entirely following that.
Yeah, I think it's the slow adjusting of personal behaviors to get in line with what's happening politically and what's acceptable in society. Okay. And as much as we have current, kind of have a very, very split politically world right now. It's very bipartisan, certainly lots of anger in both directions. But there's this slow creep of language that to me is kind of terrifying. And I think at one point earlier this year, I think the president named one of our days Loyalty Day. It was either Loyalty Day or Patriots Day. I think it was Loyalty, because Patriots Day is a different thing. But that's just a total page out of that book. It's just let's designate an entire day towards doing whatever the government says. And I think everyone was just haha, that's a stupid thing. But I think one of the lessons is, they mentioned this in the book, is that you continue to get more and more extreme in order to push the potentially less extreme end result. And so that's the thing that worries me, is you have these examples that don't seem that extreme, but there are efforts to make things more extreme.
Yes.
And I think the goal is not to get to a totally extremist thing, but it's always trying to overshoot such that the steady state thing that you end up at has moved the needle significantly. And so I think that use of language and behaviors and us as citizens and how we react is what I mean by that.
I think the flip side of that too, because I do see a lot of the parallels, is that this is the very far end of a very politically correct society, to the degree that if you're not politically correct, you die. But a lot of the techniques that are used in our politically correct society to adjust behavior, keep people in line, move forward, etc., are starting to at least similar.
Yeah,
we have lines, and I don't. There's definitely lines on the right, but there's lines on the left that we repeat in order to maintain relations with other people within our political group, and not necessarily because you believe it. I mean, a lot of these things we probably haven't even thought about a lot. It's just that's the line that signifies to everyone that you're in the same political camp. And that's terrifying.
The policing of language in particular, because it's the first step, is what I see most in the modern world. On on both sides of the political spectrum, far left, far right. It's very much that initial step into authoritarianism, whether it's national government or cliques or political agendas. You have to police the language that's used in your in-group so that you can eliminate anyone who dares think differently.
Right. So this book was kind of a bit of a bummer time? Yes? No? We're getting like increasingly like introspective and just like,
Yeah.
oh my God, it's fucking bad out there.
Yeah.
Knowing that this is real, or this was real, certainly should make you feel bad. I think that's part of its purpose. I mean, as a piece of propaganda, it was attempting to wake people up to certain unpalatable truths.
Why do you think that this book never got traction? I don't actually know where it stands in the in Asia. Actually, I read one review this morning from Taiwan. One review, but she or he, whoever, this person was saying that this book was not well received in a literary sense in Taiwan either, compared to other works. And the article was about the censorship that it took to actually get it published in Taiwan. They had to like remove Chiang Kai-shek's name and this kind of thing, which is kind of an interesting side note.
I can't imagine this is available in mainland China.
I don't know now.
Yeah, we had a guy in the book club discussion who said he was like reading this on his flight to China. He was going there for work and just had this moment of realization where he's like, oh wait, should I not have this? So yeah, I mean, maybe that's the answer, is it just has some pretty volatile content, and that I think in China there's still political lines that are really difficult to navigate.
But the whole like history of China, until I lived in Korea and traveled in China, I really didn't know that much about Chinese history, and kind of always assumed that it was maybe not that related to our history or the history of the West and whatever. I mean, obviously, increasingly, we are becoming more and more intertwined, but it just seems so relevant.
I hope that it gets a broader readership. I think it's well written, it's informative, it gives people insight into a piece of history that many, including myself, didn't know a whole lot about until I read this book and then started reading some history to accompany it. Yeah, I mean, all three of us seem to agree that it is of substance. So hopefully any people out there that are listening to this, 45 minutes into a podcast having never read it, you probably should pick it up.
After the entire plot was just ruined?
Yeah, which I don't think would stop you from enjoying it.
I don't think takes away from it, yeah.
I don't know how well or coherently we explained any plot points, but...
yeah. Feature. Yeah, I think the intro also gives away the plot, of which is also convenient when I read an intro, that by the time I get to the end of the book, I've totally forgotten what was written in the intro, so it's like totally fine. So assuming this podcast works in that same method, that you'll just forget all of these other than Nathan's clever quips, and then, it'll still stand alone. You won't have anything ruined.
There you go. That's the hope. Thanks for listening to another episode of the B.O.S. podcast. As always, you can find us online at www.booksofsomesubstance.com, where we have books that we've read in the past, books that are coming up, cool artwork, and things that we publish. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at BooksOSubstance. And until next time, keep on reading.